I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This current video is one of two that I've prepared as an introduction to my Survey of British Literature course. In the course, I pay special attention to the evolving socio-historical context in which the canonical literary texts of British literature were produced. And it is to those socio-historical contexts over a period of more than 1,000 years that I turn in this introduction. Let me begin by saying some things about the periodization of Western cultural history, the history of Western civilization. So the three periods would be medieval Europe, modern Europe, and post-modernity or late modernity. And in the first slide, I'll be talking about economic conditions pertaining to each of those three different epochs and how those economic conditions relate to the experience of being human, the experience of the individual in relation to family and society, family and community in each of those periods. So the first one, the medieval epoch, feudalism. Feudalism refers to an economic system as well as a political system. Economically, it's a system in which money capital is not the motor force of economic production. Instead, simple agricultural production, the production of crops on the land to feed a population, is what really counts. So land is the most important source of wealth in such a system. Modernity is characterized by mercantile capitalism at first and later industrial capitalism. And then finally, the current moment, which is an era characterized by new adjustments to the capitalist system economically, involving the notion of globalization, of course, but hyper-globalization made possible by modern advances in communication technologies and transportation technologies, such that, for example, we can go to the grocery store and buy a fish that has been caught off the coast of Alaska, flown to China to be cut up and processed, and then flown back here for us to buy it at the shop and eat it. The current postmodern economy is sometimes characterized as a post-industrial economy. You've all heard complaints about this, I'm sure, in the political campaigns about how you can't get a good factory job anymore. And one thing about this is that it sometimes is represented as though information technology and finance and consumerism have all displaced the economic power of industrial production. But another way of looking at it is simply that heavy industrial production has been displaced from the metropole, from the advanced industrial societies, onto the peripheral economies in the Pacific Rim, Asian Pacific Rim, or in South America or other places where labor is cheap, and because of the transportation efficiencies, things can be moved around. In medieval Europe, then, politically and economically, these societies are organized according to what were called fiefdoms, in which there's a very hierarchical top-down status order, and most of the people don't live so well. Most of the people are peasants. It's a triangle model of a social structure with a very few very rich and powerful aristocrats at the top and a large mass of peasants just barely living at the bottom. The modern period, to the year 1950 or so, is characterized by the emergence of capitalism, first mercantile capitalism, the expansion of international trade in more than simply luxury goods, and the growth of towns and cities, the development of craft guild production and economies that will lead to the emergence of a large middle class, and not simply a very few very rich aristocrats at the top of an order and lots of peasants at the bottom. And eventually, the emergence of the nation state and republican and democratic forms of government. And when I say republican and democratic forms of government, I'm using those terms with a small d and a small r, not referring to our particular political parties in the United States, But the idea of popular representation, the idea that leaders are chosen by merit in some way, and that societies are governed by constitutions or consensual agreements in which it's assumed that the government is by consent and not by decree. Also, a dark side of that period, the emergence of colonialism, in which the advanced industrial countries usurped and exploited resources from other places that they were able to dominate because of their advanced military power. Then post-modernity, I mentioned already finance capitalism and post-industrialism, but also a shift to post-nationalism, in which supranational organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund exert some kind of political power, maybe indirect political power, but nonetheless it has some effects, and governments, national governments, have their activities constrained. So post-nationalism and then also post-colonialism, a moment deriving from after the 1950s, after World War II, when, owing to the demise of the notion that the advanced industrial societies were really more advanced ethically and morally than underdeveloped societies, when after World War II, after the Holocaust, that argument was much harder to make with a straight face than it had been to make earlier. And so an era of decolonization was set in motion, in which countries that had been formerly colonized were either organized or organized themselves as nation states and entered into the United Nations and into participation with these other economic organizations and supranational political entities on something of at least a nominal equal footing with the advanced industrial countries. Well, what does this mean for any individual? What do these things mean for the experience of anyone living in one of these societies? I will assert repeatedly during the semester that it means quite a lot, and it's helpful to link the experience of being human to these organizational structures, economic and political. And I would also include family and church and educational system, all of those things. All of those things are interlinked and connected in ways that make it a different experience for someone to be a human in a feudal medieval society than it is for someone to live in our society. And so in the medieval society, there is a communal subjectivity, or one doesn't even think of the concept of the individual in the way that we have come to think of the concept of the individual in modernity and post-modernity. Who you are is so much determined by the class you're born in, the land you're born on, your extended family relations, and your place in the hierarchy, that your scope of mobility as an individual is very highly constrained. Modernity, then, is the era of high emphasis on humanist individualism. It's the moment, historically, when people start leaving the farms and going into the towns and cities and working in mills. In the cities, the individual becomes detached from the familial order and the small community order. You get to the city, you can pretend to be someone more than who you were back home. And people did. Also, at the same time, with these economic changes, a middle class, a prosperous middle class, began to gain economic power, eventually to clamor for political power. And so during that 500 or 600 year period in which modernity unfolds more and more, we begin to think of ourselves as individuals. This has implications for family relations, for one's religious sensibility and understanding, all sorts of things. On that point, I'll conclude this webcast. I'll follow it up with another video in which I discuss the problematization and the fragmentation of the individual in our current moment of postmodernity. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.